Welcome to the Digital Transformation Lab at University College of Cork Expert Series. This is the 6-part series that is covering digital leadership, strategy, disruption, transformation, innovation, and accessibility. My name is Antonio Santos, and I will be your host for today. So the way we work is rapidly changing. Remote work has led to more distributed teams. The increasing proliferation of complex problems demands more collaborative approaches that break down traditional divides between organizations, teams, and skill sets. So today I would like to welcome Fran Willis White, founder and principal of WOW Consulting, John Morley, a business design strategist at Hitachi Vantara, and Paidi O'Reilly, researcher, innovation professor at University College of Cork. So welcome everyone. I hope everyone is looking forward to follow the event today. And I will jump right to the question, and I will ask Fran. You have been working for with large organizations, Disney and many others, and you have worked with a lot of executives. What changes have you observed in leadership in recent times?
Well, the benefit of having as long a career as I've had is that I've seen what's required of leaders shift dramatically from the classic hierarchies and the ability to control decisions and actions from top down to the need today for the ability to tap the collective intelligence of an organization in a more horizontal or collaborative way. And I would say that's probably the biggest shift. And that takes a kind of courage that is the challenge.
John, you work also with large organizations. What shifts have you observed in terms at the leadership level with the organizations that you work, and from others that I'm sure you are curious of looking at as well?
Yeah, I think much of what Fran was talking about, and I think I've seen both sides. Actually, I sent a note to somebody today and said I've had a ringside seat for a lot of corporate dysfunction as much as I've been in sort of seen some great transformative things happen. I think we're at this really interesting point where there's sort of an expertise versus adaptive mindset sort of divide. Not I won't say divide, but there's this transformation. And I think that's one of the things we'll explore now. For me, I'm definitely looking for leadership that understands that it has to be adaptive and that it cannot see everything from its own perspective. So it needs to engage. It would be the biggest.
But from your research and observations, I'm almost sure that we all seen situations where organizations were somehow being very restrictive in terms of remote working. There was, maybe this is not for us. And then COVID came in, and now we all need to jump into remote work. What changes have you seen regarding those changes at the leadership level?
Yeah, so I suppose the world has changed. Now, in some cases, leadership maybe isn't changing as quickly as the world is changing. And I think sometimes when we answer these questions, we're talking more about what leadership should look like than actually what it does look like. And I think that's one of the issues. I think some organizations, some leaderships have been very slow to change. They're talking about changing everything else other than the way they lead. So, and I think that's something that we need to be very much aware of. I think where organizations have come from and where they're going during COVID is obviously at the very, very start, there was a real crisis, and it was about keeping people safe, and it was that crisis response. And I think the way you lead in a crisis response is very different to how maybe you then manage a crisis, which is beyond that period of when you're trying to keep people safe, but you're then trying to maybe maintain business during a crisis. And the leadership during that is again very different, you know. So maybe crisis response is more like wartime leadership. Crisis management is a far more structured way of maybe leading. But the key thing for me is what are we going to do next? Are we going to go back to type? Are we going to go back to those old styles of leadership that aren't particularly effective? Or are we now going to design organizations, solutions, systems, everything else that are really centered on humans, people, you know? And I think if we're to do that, then we need a collaborative, a transformative collaborative style of leadership.
Can I jump in on that? I was thinking about what John said about adaptive versus expertise, and what you just said, Paidi. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is I boil it down to leadership typically has a higher level of expertise than, say, the newer members of an organization. And shifting from expertise to adaptive is a leap of courage that is frightening. And, you know, helping people through the fear from what used to work to what works now is, I think, the challenge of leadership today, to become collaborative.
Yeah, and I love that idea, Fran, because I think sometimes we're afraid to let go, you know, and I think there's a bit of that, you know. Unfortunately, a lot of our leaders have been educated in the same way, you know, going to certain MBA schools and taught very traditional forms of management and leadership. In some cases, we conflate management for leadership. For me, they're really different things, you know. Leadership is about leading people. Management is about managing assets, you know, and getting the most out of them. So I think I completely agree with you, Fran. I think sometimes there's a fear of letting go and just going into the unknown, you know, and actually embracing new forms of leadership.
And I think we have done that fear or resistance a disservice. I in my conversations with John, I talk about decriminalizing that resistance. It's instinctive. It's in our brains. It's perfectly normal. So the question becomes, how do we help people through that, knowing it's going to happen? How do we get through it as quickly as possible? Because you have to move quickly if you're going to innovate and transform today. And then one more thing, John, I'm going to throw it over to you. The other thing that, besides the fear of letting go, is the upset about letting go of power.
Oh, yeah.
Take it away, John.
I think, well, so as you can gather, we've had a few chats. I think one of the things that stands out for me, and we'll jump down the rabbit hole a little bit here, is looking at the different type of I suppose cognitive mix that you have when you're actually looking at a transformation. One of my favorite stories, and comes from a few years back, is I was working for myself, and I went into an organization, and they were talking a lot about how, well, they, you know, it's all about servant leadership here, you know, and the servant leadership sort of manifested itself in an inability to make any decisions. So they swiped out the layer below them and brought in a bunch of what we call finisher completers. And suddenly you've got an organization that has been used to indecisiveness switching violently over to one where all these decisions were being made in a vacuum. So I think when we talk about like the challenges that leadership has, and sort of saying, well, the leadership that optimizes a certain situation isn't necessarily the one to actually explore the next. It's very complex. It's very challenging, and I think it's not easy for certain.
Yeah, and I think that is a very good point, because yeah, and even during the short number of months, you know, back to March of COVID, John, the leaders that have really excelled in one phase of that aren't necessarily the leaders that are excelling in the other phases, you know. And in some cases, even politically, we talk about how maybe leaders have shown real leadership during the crisis, yet really struggled, you know, to make a difference outside of the crisis, you know. And you know, we say, you know, that Churchill is like a wartime leader, but actually probably didn't do very well when there was no war, you know. And I love that idea that actually sometimes the type of leader really is a leader of a time and of a phase.
Something that I've been observing is that sometimes within organizations, and when we go to Twitter, LinkedIn, is contradicting messages between leaders of organizations. Some people seem very keen in adopting new ways of working. Others, oh, we really need we really need the office to innovate. That face-to-face relationships are really keen. While others say, no, we already moved from that. We can innovate from anywhere. So how do you see this type of contradictions? Do you feel that is this a question of adjusting? Is this a question of talent? What is people afraid of?
Yeah, so I'll kick off that one maybe, and I'll let it up to the other two guys then to score the goal. So yeah, I think with probably innovation, we know as well, Antonio, and you know as well as anyone that innovation is about, you know, the movement of knowledge and letting knowledge combine and letting knowledge collide, you know. So of course, any environment that reduces the flow of knowledge or the opportunities for knowledge colliding is going to really reduce innovation, definitely in the medium to longer term. And one of the big concerns at the moment is, again, is I think people are conflating, you know, change because of a crisis, a response to a crisis, to being, you know, the same as maybe innovation for the longer term. And yet I think they're very different things. You know, I think crisis response are things we have to do, and we have to do them now. It's very clear why we're doing them. You know, there's a very specific focus on the enemy being COVID. On the other hand, if you're innovating for the long term, there is no enemy, there is no future. You know, that's what you have to figure out. And it's a very different style of change, you know. So I think the difficulties at the moment is that we have reduced the number of social collisions between people because they're working remotely. I think there's now evidence that shows that, funnily enough, that we're more likely to connect with someone on the other side of the world than we are to someone on the same street as us, which is a bit bizarre, you know. And I don't think we've really figured out what the longer term impact of that is going to be, other than I think organizations now are starting to worry a bit more about it, because obviously I suppose the prognosis for the next maybe 12 months, you know, in terms of COVID and the need for social distancing means that again those collisions are likely to reduce.
I'd love to add in on Paidi. One of the things for me is just purely behavior. There's a very simple model that I love sort of using. It's kind of profound. It's called B.J. Fogg's behavioral model, and his little mantra is that behavior is it's the letters are MAT, your motivation, your ability, and whatever triggers you. I think that's one of the things as we go in, and we have a sort of a fixed behavior around how we handle certain things. And it is uncomfortable to have to change your perspective or say, well, look, I've been doing this very successfully in this space. But the classic sort of innovator's dilemma is that, well, that works in a certain situation, but as soon as you go outside, they probably won't work there anymore. So the tie I would make there is, I really like the explore and exploit models that we see in sort of in vogue today, because with exploration, what you can really do is go and try a whole series of different efforts and see what might actually stick. And it gives you, in one sense, a path for you to move from where you've been to where you might go. And the reason I sort of go to that is that I've seen far too many times where an organization sort of says, well, we did that now, but we're now going to do this. I mean, that's a very big risk to take, and with your whole organization jump from one thing to the next. Why would you not sort of consider maybe testing in small batches as you go along?
And I would say what, Antonio, you said that there's a contradiction or different types of voices. And I think the future belongs to the organizations and the teams that can hold those contradictions. And I would maybe use John's terms, even when we're in exploration, the leadership imperative is to be able to shepherd and entertain ideas. And when we're in the action or exploit model, then the conversations are driven toward action. And it's a different approach to how I behave. And I think the same leader can do both, but they have to be able to be conscious of what phase they're in.
Fran, could I? So you triggered exactly where I'd wanted to go was, one of the things I think is difficult in a larger organization is the processes that are in place. So, for instance, if you look at something like OKRs, objectives and key results, fantastic for exploitation. I happen to think terrible for exploration. But I have observed you get a lot of innovation is actually being measured the way exploitation is, and so we got to be cognizant of those processes that can actually get in our way, and they can get very cemented in,
Well, they make people feel safe. This has worked for me before, and I find comfort in that. And when everything else is making me feel unmoored or uncomfortable, finding a process that you don't even have to think about it. Like, the work that we get to do each day that we call administrative or whatever, there's no challenge in that. And we crave some of that, especially today.
Yeah, and like, I suppose a question is, how do we get organizations to concurrently explore and exploit? I suppose that's been a challenge for a long time in terms of what sort of organization is that? What does it look like? How do you structure it? How do you lead it? Some organizations went to the idea of dual CEOs. One over the operational engine and another one over the, I suppose, the innovation engine. And I know, Antonio, we shared some stuff around that. It's maybe not worked as well in some organizations, yet they're held up as sort of the case studies of how to do this well. But I suppose the challenge still is that organizations, when it comes to it, always goes back to the exploitation thing. And if they're big enough, they might buy in innovation, or they might acquire, I suppose, technologies or companies that are really become the exploration part of the business. So how do we do it though, guys?
No, let me interact on that. I've seen organizations who have change engines. I think almost every organization have a group of pirates, people who are working on this kind of new projects, but they never had the buy-in from leadership. And they are changing smallpox in the organization. They are innovating from the inside. So I think what will be interesting to see is how are organizations going to address the current challenges and also take advantage of all the knowledge that this kind of explorers already did over the last couple of years. So how can we, what will be the role of leadership in order to create more collaborative organizations at the same time that you are able to leverage all the knowledge that you have inside that already went some of the routes to solve the problem that leaders need to solve today?
I'd love to
go on, John.
So Paidi knows this is a hot spot for me. I love that question, Antonio. I come at it a slightly roundabout way. One is I'm a huge fan of global learning programs and learning programs for doing this in building cultures of innovation at the middle and at the bottom. And it's, I don't think so much it's something that leadership can mandate as much as nourish. And it takes self-aware leadership to allow that to happen. Paidi, I'm going to steal one of your sound bites about, I'll even let you maybe say it, but the thinking big, think big, start small, move fast.
That's it, yeah.
And part of that is just when you find the people that are dotted around the organization that sort of do connect the dots and are bright lights, is connect them, support them, give them a safe space, encourage them. I've personally just found that learning organizations are particularly good at doing that. But then give them that executive air cover to actually go do small little projects and embed that culture, because if the culture is embedded, it's brilliant. But you can't mandate it from the top down.
And what happens though, John, let's say you locate these real catalysts within organizations. Don't a lot of organizations just squeeze them out? They squeeze out the energy, the enthusiasm and everything else. So even if they're there, they're not effective, they're not engaged. How do we get around that?
For me, it's the way I've always said it is leaders have two very limited resources, their time and their money. And so if you're trying to nourish a culture of innovation, you have to spend your time and your money with the people who are those, I'll say, bright lights, and just whose mind is about where we're headed. And so what typically happens is we say we're going to innovate, and we have a, you use Rogers' curve of innovation, is you have a small percentage of people who are the catalysts, a small percentage of people who are dragging, have no interest in innovating. And that leaves everybody else on the fence waiting to see if it's worth it to get uncomfortable. And the people they look at are the leaders. And typically leaders spend their time trying to get the people who are dragging to buy in. And that is a colossal waste of time. And the idea that you can get somebody to buy in to a new way of behaving before you institute it is, I think, one of the big fallacies that we're seeing in what is typically called change management is, until I see that I have an opportunity to succeed, don't ask me to buy in, because I'm just going to give you lip service. And it goes back to what Paidi just said, think big, act small. Act small is where we get the buy-in, and then we can act fast.
So I'll add on, Fran, love that. I also think for me, a turning point in my career was when I realized that the organization doesn't exist to look after me. That as employees, we have, if we have aspirations, then it's on us to actually be resilient and actually take the shocks when they come. And I think that's the power. And one of the things of identifying these catalysts is to an extent arm them, but we are all accountable for ourselves too. So I think there's a balance there. I don't think it's all on the leadership by any means. I think we've got to foster a culture that actually allows people to explore, but also it's not, the organization doesn't exist to look after us. I think there's that balance that has to be found.
Yeah, and sometimes I think, like Fran says, we're obsessed with the naysayers and bring them out, and yet we give so little to the pioneers, and we put so little into them, and we spend all these resources on the other end of that adoption cycle, with the naysayers. So and I think it's a big problem, and I think actually, funny enough, the topic of the conversation today is really that collaborative leadership doesn't look at innovation just from the point of view of inside the boundaries of the organization. It actually looks at it as an ecosystem and say, yeah, look, the core of the organization is very efficient. It's a great operational, efficient engine. But actually, innovation, if we look at it as an ecosystem, it can be right around that organization. So the core is strong at operation, the ecosystem is strong at innovation. And I think we need to start thinking in terms of innovation, and for a number of reasons, because first and foremost is a lot of the catalysts, the pioneers, don't want to be part of the core. On the other hand, they want to be part maybe outside of the innovation system. And like if we look at the likes of Xerox and all those, a lot of the people that just couldn't find a home in terms of innovation there left to create the companies outside that later became the technologies that maybe the likes of Apple and all were bringing in. So I think we need to start thinking more in terms of the ecosystem and that collaborative type of leadership.
You were mentioned about ecosystem, but when we look at today's ecosystem, I've seen many organizations bringing to the conversation customers, partners, employees, and they all become part of that ecosystem. It's part of the process to create this. I've seen organizations establishing this type of ecosystems to deal with cybersecurity challenge, where they bring all the partners and they have conversations and they try to advocate on best practice on cybersecurity outside the organization and inside the organization. Of course, in order to do this, you need a different type of leadership. You need leaders to have some level of visibility, and we know that some people don't like to have that level of exposure. But today, that's something that is really, really needed. So, what are the personal threats of an effective collaborative leader in the times that we are in, where this emergency of collaboration is there and needs to be addressed?
Again,
So, Yeah, John, yeah, I'll hand that one to you.
I'll take a stab and go on. For me, number one is self-awareness. Know what you don't know is just as important as knowing what you do. I think that's one. A couple of other things, and it ties into that adaptive mindset, is understand what is complexity, and that it's really impossible in today's world to think that from, say, my position, that I can see all points of view around a topic and actually go and act on it. It has to be collaborative. And also the concept that a project or an initiative can have multiple points of view, and that's okay. It's finding that. I know, Fran, maybe I'll hand over to you, and I'll hand you the ball. Mightn't be the ball that you want, but the shared purpose and understanding the value of that.
Yeah. So one of the things John and I talk about is, we talk about collaboration, we talk about innovation, we talk about transformation. And I think one of the challenges for most of the people in an organization is to answer the question, so that what? So if we're looking to innovate, understanding what the overarching intention is helps us know what we can contribute, and how to evaluate potential solutions or potential mechanisms. And so I think there are a lot of people who think of innovation as coming up with new ways of doing things in a vacuum. Well, this is new, or it's innovative, which may not serve the purpose of serving our customers or our internal folks. And so when we talk about collaborative leadership, I think it helps to keep in mind that the intention of collaborative leadership is ultimately to tap the collective genius of an organization to make decisions quickly. Having a collaborative leadership that slows things down doesn't serve transformation of any type. So it's, I want to hear what everybody has to say, but the goal is, like, we can make decisions faster horizontally than we can the way we used to, where it has to go top down. So I think keeping in mind the goal of why we're operating in a collaborative fashion helps.
So, Fran, let me ask you that. What examples have you seen of organizations who were very effective in untapping that collective intelligence?
I'm trying to be politically correct here. I have seen organizations who have a culture that supports differences among people. I think Southwest Airlines is the best example I can share with you, because it has such a powerful culture. And the way that they collaborate is that the people who are being interviewed to do a job are interviewed by the people who do that job, not somebody in HR who's looking to fill a job description. But if you're going to be a pilot interviews you. And so they have a way of supporting each other and expecting each other to be the best at what they do. And as a result, they do things that are technically not possible. Their turnaround time on their planes, if you ask an engineer to track how long it should take to empty and refill a plane, they do it faster than an engineer tells you it can be done. And in part because of the way they, I've never used this word before, but the way they treasure each other. Does that make sense?
It does.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, guys, is, and I know I was arguing maybe in favor of collaboration early, and throwing the gauntlet down, but I also think we need to remember that there's certain other C words, where we've got some activity, and I was just writing as we're talking here, coordination is enough. It's just that we need to coordinate what I do with what you do, so that it's like on a supply chain, we deliver something of value. There's also cooperation, which is where you're going to help me achieve my aim. you know, so it's cooperation. On the other hand, collaboration, it's where we have overlapping, I suppose, points where we've got that new vision that Fran is talking about. We've a shared vision that we can't achieve except if we work together. So I don't think that everything we call collaboration is collaboration. I don't think we should always be collaborating on everything we do. But I think when it comes to collaboration, we obviously have certain aspects that are important. The drive to build relationships. And relationships where we're not just looking at it from what we will win, we will get from it, but maybe win-win. Also, I think then if you're really collaborative, you need to let go of some of the control and let the network actually take some of that control, and you have to go and be willing to go with it. And that's that fear we spoke about earlier, the fear of letting go and the fear of trust. I see someone here, was it Noel, talking about in the chat about the importance of trust. And then there's conflict, I suppose I would have a very different view of conflict. For me and maybe some of the research we're doing, we've actually found that that conflict can be quite positive, that you need people with diverse views to be able to express those diverse views. And very often that means we disagree, and you need to allow people to disagree. If you don't allow that disagreement, you end up maybe with something like groupthink, etc. So I think if you add all those characteristics up there, it's a different type of leader. I think emotional intelligence is also very important to it. But this willingness to let go of control and to trust the ecosystem, to trust the network.
I have to jump in there because it goes back to what you were saying about act small, is that when I first become aware that I'm going to be asked to work differently or behave differently or execute an innovative process, the first thing I'm going to do is to slow down and hang on much tighter to what was, in an effort to feel, when I say safe, I mean our brain is telling us that we are at risk, that we are not safe. And one of the distinctions I want to throw in the pot here is when I am operating instinctively, asking me to trust somebody else is like asking a goldfish to climb a tree. I have to be able to move through that instinctive resistance with a small act before we can even begin to talk about trust or buy-in. And I think that awareness actually helps people understand what's actually going on.
I love that. Can I, yeah. So Fran, I really like that. And it leads me, my bias coming in here. I'm a models guy. I love understanding models. And one of those is the Lencioni pyramid, our triangle of trust. So Paidi, I mean, where we work, we're always arguing with each other, but it's because we trust each other. And the base of that pyramid of functional teams is trust. If you trust, you can have conflict. If you can get through conflict, you can actually crack things open. But it's really important to create that safe space. And I think that's one of the things, to the point you mentioned about slowing down, Fran. Another thing that I always love is the concept of Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. It's a little bit the tortoise and the hare, right? If you want to win the race, slow down up front for a moment and be really clear about what you're trying to do, because clarity brings competence. If you don't establish the clarity, we get into command and control as we go down the line. So
I have to jump on that too, because the way Kahneman, there's a guy named Robert Eichinger, and he's now at Korn Ferry, but he's a neuro leadership expert. He coined that term. And one of the things he talks about in terms of helping people move through change quickly is when leaders understand and can speak to that fear. The model is the SCARF model, and I won't go into that in detail, but basically when you understand what people feel is at risk and you can speak to that, then they can open their ears to the big vision. But the idea of we're all going to make money and our clients are going to be happier when I'm going to lose my reputation. I'm going to look like an idiot. I don't want to try something new in front of my colleagues. You have to do both.
Yeah, and so I think just pulling some of it together, guys, and we know now top performing teams don't tend to be smaller teams, but we also know from maybe studies, whether it's Amy Edmondson or others, to know that psychological safety is the key element to the performance of teams. You know, that we need to feel secure enough to be able to disagree, you know, and it's only through disagreement that we start to hear, you know, of issues and start to address them. But also I'd like to pull on something, and it's maybe only in the last few months that it has struck me and it's been playing my mind a bit, is someone that we know, Ed Morrison, talking about this idea that when we're trying to get coherency among different groups, we've a habit of abstracting up to the point of where the vision is meaningless. It's so abstract that no one can agree or disagree with it because no one really knows what it is. It's so abstract. Whereas what Ed would talk about is actually going the other way, actually becoming more precise, more concrete about what we're talking about, and that really drives out those conversations, those disagreements.
Yeah.
You know, and it would really and what Ed says would really resonate with my own experience, that sometimes going up, abstracting up, you get nowhere really. Sometimes you're better off going the other way and actually making the conversation far more concrete.
Sorry to just go right. I remember another situation similar to what you're saying here from a few years ago, where I was working with an organization that was trying to transform its go-to-market, and they grabbed a bunch of, you know, the leaders and they put them in a room, and there was one particular lady wwho wasn't in leadership, and she had a very successful go-to-market model, and nobody wanted to pay attention to that. And eventually a customer came around and said, look, this is how I want to work with you. And so the reason I sort of make that link is that sometimes, you know, there was a very concerted effort to drive something from the top down because they had this vision. And actually what the market was saying to them was, actually, we like working this way with you, and you're already doing it. So I sort of love the point.
So we have a few ideas and questions here coming to us from the chats, and I've written a few weeks ago about collaboration. I don't know, John, you are in Fran, you are both in the States, and going to the point of collaboration at different levels. Do you feel that a company can run the world from Seattle, or what I mean is, can a company run the world from the head office in the times that we are in, considering how much talent that they might have in Argentina, in Korea, or in China, who are now all working remotely? Do you see that that's still the prevailing model, or do you see organizations more willing to open in order to let everyone innovate and share knowledge?
Oh, I want to jump on that because I think this is a great example of we have our expectations and our assumptions about what has to happen for things to work based on the world before COVID. And so I think we have this craving for everybody to get back into the office because that's what has always worked. And what the world is telling us, the context right now, is we have these conditions called COVID that say, we don't really care how you feel about getting back into the office. You can't right now. So the question becomes, if we have to run the world from Seattle, how do we do that well, as opposed to saying, we can't do this remotely because we may have to for the foreseeing future. So you know, I vote for getting back into the office, don't get me wrong, but we don't have that option right now. So how do we do what we need to do given today's conditions?
So if Fran, on top of that, two models that come to mind. If I go back 16, 17 years, Malcolm Gladwell wrote The Tipping Point, which for me at the time was the best damn book I'd read in a long time. And he talked about the power of networks and people being tightly bound. And Gladwell himself will actually come back and say today, he said, I got the tightly bound part wrong. And so there's another guy, Greg Sattel, who's written for me one of the best books in the last couple of years called Cascades. And Greg talks about how you drive a movement. I think in COVID, large global organizations have to start thinking of themselves as movements. And movements are this concept of small groups loosely connected, but with a shared purpose. And in the European Union, politically, we talk about subsidiarity between the member states and the European Union itself. This concept, Fran, the difference between the federal and the state level here. There's a certain amount of wiggle room. I think organizations, global ones, they've got to allow for that wiggle room, because if you share purpose sort of at the local level, then I know this is my bias coming in. How I do it shouldn't particularly matter.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, like I think it's a great question, and I think it's a question probably exercising more and more minds at the moment. I think as the world is getting increasingly complex, so like even let's say in Ireland and UK at the moment, we're not just talking about COVID, we're talking about Brexit, we're talking about recession, and I was just I said to someone today, I was just reading over the weekend, there's also maybe the threat of a volcano in Iceland re-erupting. So all this is happening locally, and like these are incredibly complex local systems, and how can you really understand those from the other side of the globe, especially if you don't have people even originally from or with a sensitivity to what's happening in Europe or wherever else. So I think there's again, it was something I was talking about earlier today. I think there's this law of requisite variety, it's called. The more complex something becomes, the more complex your organization needs to become in terms of the diversity of views, the cognitive diversity. So I think, especially in the modern world where we're hollowing out organizations, we got leaner and leaner management and leadership teams. The diversity isn't really there to manage and lead organizations that are essentially positioned elsewhere in the globe. And I think that model is broken. I think organizations are realizing it's broken, and they're looking for an alternative approach. That idea of is it Stanley McChrystal talking about the team within teams, or how can we get and develop these local teams that are sufficiently empowered, that believe in our values, but that we will trust to make decisions locally in the best interest of the communities that are local, but also the organization that's local. So I think the model as it is broken. I think there's a natural move, and we're seeing a move towards that alternative model.
Oh, Paidi, but you are at university, you are doing research, and you just mentioned a series of topics that relate are more anthropological and sociological than anything else. As you know, large organizations are not known for having these people in leadership roles. They might have, computer engineers, people from a finance background. So do you feel that, how can companies fill in the blanks of this kind of a black spot in relation to society as a whole? Do you need for them to bring some of people who are more aware of society changes to their teams? How can they be, because after all, this is a big blind spot in many organizations. How can they fill in this blind spot?
Yeah, so like yeah, there is a blind spot there to an extent, Antonio, because as I said earlier, I'm not sure this has been taught, even to future leaders, So I think that's maybe where the blind spot comes from. But I think any of us being human can see what's happening, if you can't listen to kids nowadays, young teenagers, people in their 20s, they don't want to work for those types of organizations that don't care about what's happening locally or globally, so I think the world has changed, but it's been changing for a while. Some people would hold the likes of Visa and what Hawk was doing in Visa, that idea of giving power out to the local operations, and that's decades old. If you look at the open source software movement going back decades, we can see these types of models working very effectively there. So I think there's definitely bright spots around this globe where we can see this model has been there with decades. It's just that it hasn't become mainstream, I suppose, in very powerful organizations that have been powerful because they've been literally able to mandate, and dictate what the market wants. But I think that's changing.
Could I jump? So I love this whole thread. I give a short bit of my own history, sort of lead into why I got interested in this. I came out to the US with EMC, and EMC was based in Cork, Boston, multinational. And when I came out, initially I was given a role to do, and there was no way we could do it with the team we had. We actually had to network to get the thing done, and that was part of the challenge and the beauty of that culture. And that led me into understanding design thinking, and then design thinking led me into understanding that actually you needed to collaborate, you needed to have spin up, spin down teams of teams to get it done. And the more I looked at that, the more I realized actually that's putting me on a completely different course to the way the organization is structured. So one of the things I've become very sort of pro is that organizations might look at their employee base not in terms of roles within a hierarchy, but actually skills and competences that can be connected depending on what situation is actually in front of them or can be explored. And that takes you into adaptiveness. It takes you into having to organize like a network. Antonio, I love that you talked about anthropology and ethnology, and there's two things in here. First of all, organizations are going to have to wake up to anthropology and ethnology, because it is actually how the world, I mean, I know very little about them, and Fran, I hand over to you there in a sec, but on that, but one last thought on that is that if an organization started sitting back and you're going, oh geez, no, I have to learn about this thing, you don't. You've got self-directed learners in your workforce that would give their right arm to go after this for you. So this is why it has to be collaborative and inclusive. So Fran, sorry, I'll hand back to you.
I would just throw in a recommendation there. I use a tool called the Belden Team Roles, and I've been using it for 20 years, and I have a bias toward it because unlike a lot of personality assessments, it helps people understand how they contribute to a team process overall. And so John mentioned completer finishers. Those are the detail people. John is naturally what Belden calls a resource investigator, which is if something needs to happen in the organization, this person is looking at what's happening in the world and how to bring that in. And then there's the role that he called the plant, and that is the person whose natural contribution is ideas after ideas after ideas. And what he found in his research is that that is the biggest gap in management teams, especially in tech firms. That they have tech firms have a tendency to spin out the true mind of an innovator. And so using an assessment like that, or understanding that you need all these types of people to create a workable, sustainable solution, I think helps people move through that. So if I'm a detail person, here's one example I've seen over and over again. I worked in a couple of consulting firms. I worked in Accenture for a little while, and the leader of the division that I was in was actually a plant or an innovator. And so people loved working for him because he was so creative, and he always had a great solution. What drove them crazy is they would start to execute, and he kept coming back in and saying, wait, I got a better idea. Wait, I got a better idea. And so it's like everything else, you have to find the balance of, are we exploring or exploiting, and, assign leaders to each phase.
One last thought, Paidi, I know you're very close to this. Fran, taking that mix, and the guy who comes in, so I'm going to iterate now, Ed Morrison talks a lot about being very clear of the cognitive diversity, Paidi, on the core teams. And I've seen you talk about this as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. I think Ed talks about maybe having the cognitive diversity maybe on the team from the start. So you've people, he talks about the sort of the development S curve, you've got the, I suppose, the pioneers right up to, I suppose, those convincing the pragmatists and right up to the naysayers and converting those, but also about, I suppose, the different types of ways we tackle problems, in terms of, you can have people that are far more comfortable with exploring. You can have people that are far more comfortable with exploiting, and there's a curve, an S curve, and sort of saying that we need people at all steps in on that S curve. On the other hand, a lot maybe in the innovation with space would say that the team should change its construction as it moves along with an idea, if it's to follow the idea. So you might have a very heavy creative element at the start, but that maybe starts to roll down because they lose interest once it becomes something more firm, you know, and they're on to the next thing. But what you then do is bring in maybe the engineers, the logistics people, the whatever else. So the nature of the team changes as you go along. I think if we don't do that, what you find is certain people feel they just naturally start to disengage because it's no longer the stage that the idea is at or the innovation is at, is just no longer, you know, something that energizes them. So I think sometimes you're better off actually changing the construction of the team as you go along, but it should always match, you know, I suppose the vision of what it is you're trying to do. People know what that vision is.
I would add that before I'm going to jump in.
Sorry, Fran.
We talked about conflict earlier. One of the things I've seen over and over again with teams that take this Belbin assessment and apply it is that a lot of what they used to call personality conflict or conflict on the teams is actually role conflict. And so where I've seen that is I've been on a team where we were creating a new workshop and we were at the phase of trying to figure out what content should go in it and how creative we could be. And there was a woman on the team who was asking what color the notebooks would be. And so there was some energy conflict there. And what we figured out, of course, is she needed to come in at the detail piece, not that she didn't need to be in the team meeting necessarily, but if we understand which role aligns with where we are in the process, then we can allow people to move to the forefront in terms of leading the team meeting or the team process.
No, I was just going to, so in on top of both of those, I work a lot with data scientists. So one of the things that we had actually been looking a little bit, and I can't say to you that this is coming or not coming, but was how you might do what data science would classify as cohort analysis to understand what's the best cohort to bring to a particular point in a project or initiative. Kind of curious to see how that all comes out, right? But
I am too.
Yeah. And actually that area is fascinating because what it's trying to do is figure out the correct team for the given context. But sometimes the problem is we don't fully understand the context. It's only when we start to work within the context that we start to understand the context. So how messy or how wicked is it? How complex is it? It's sometimes only when you're halfway in, 2/3 way in, 3/4 way, and you say, God, this is messy, this is complex. Yeah. And yet the type of team you need for a sort of complex problem is very different to a more structured problem. So part of the issue, I think, John, I'm fascinated by the same areas is you nearly need to understand the context as much as the problem in order to figure out the right team. And sometimes they have to co-evolve, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this type of complexity might require a level of flexibility within the organizations than before. You can't know everyone as a role, and you can't. Some organizations might find very difficult to suddenly move people from a project to another, or even try to find the right talent in the organization to assign to that project. No, everybody in the end might have to. Everybody needs to book time to projects on a regular basis. Can you advise to organizations in order to try to address the need to solve all these problems and be able to bring the right people to them in an effective way?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem is the way we view innovation, Antonio. So sometimes we just view innovation as a project here and a project there and a project somewhere else. Whereas I think if we're really serious about innovation, we need to professionalize it. And also we need to treat it as some sort of portfolio approach, that you constantly have projects on the go. Okay, so as a person that's let's say that's far more creative, as they're finishing one project, they're moving on to the next one. You know, the problem in lots of cases is there's nowhere for them to go because we don't have that portfolio approach. We don't have sufficient projects on the go. And of course, these projects could end at the drop of a hat because you've brought them to the stage where you now realize it's not worth going forward. But we always need a portfolio of projects. And I think, like, depending on the rules of thumb, the heuristics, there should be probably 10% of our resources always going into these sort of far-reaching, longer-term projects. You know, a bit more then in terms of the adjacent ones, and those that are core innovation probably takes the majority, maybe 70% of our resource. But we always need a number of projects on the go so that we can then move people between the projects. And I think that's the issue. A lot of companies, they don't have that portfolio approach. So as a person finishing on one, there's nowhere to go except back to business as usual. And it will depending on the type of character there, that could be essentially I'm going to leave the company card, you know.
Yeah. I'd love to, so building right on top of that, Paidi, I love that portfolio perspective and sort of putting some stability underneath innovation. There's two separate thoughts that come to mind for me. One is that organizations themselves are complex, and layers of the organization are not all moving at the same pace. So if you think of, you know, the team of people that you need to run your CRM, your ERP, your big honking SAP databases, listen, you don't want to be chopping and changing that every couple of months. But the people that are out talking to customers and have the pulse on what's happening in the market, they do need to be adaptive. So I mean, it's not that everybody needs to be adaptive all the time. It's we need to acknowledge where are the different layers of pace, and then where do they converge. And so the two other quick things I wanted to tie with that is, one is strategy is a very important word, and my sense is some people do it really well and some people don't. And I think it's good to be as good as you can be about your strategy. And one of my favorite models for that is Roger Martin's strategy cascade, and he talks about 5 parts of it. You know, what's the aspiration, where will we play, how will we win, what skills do we need, and what systems do we need? 5 actually very simple interlocking questions, and it's amazing when you ask people those questions that there's usually a gap somewhere. And I'll say one last thing on that is that the onus for that continuous innovation, I think, can be on the employee base as much as it is on the leadership, as long as that innovation culture is put in place. And this is where we talk about the concept of catalysts in particular, right? So it's identifying them and encouraging them.
And Paidi, I would say that in terms of finding ways for your innovators to contribute, there is the creating whatever is next part of innovation. And then there's also directing those minds to places in the organization where a problem has to be solved, where they're stuck in terms of something that, where especially, again, I'll go back to where I've worked in IT firms. What I've learned is that a lot of people who are in IT are kind of process people. And if you have a whole team full of process people and they get stuck, bringing somebody in with that innovator mentality can help them come up with a new way of solving their own internal client issues. Make sense?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on, Fran. And it means organizations need to be self-aware of the capabilities they themselves have in their organizations. Now, that sounds as if it's every organization, of course, would know that, but they don't. You know, it's a big issue. We don't even know what makes our own employees tick, you know, in terms of their profile, the type of work they want, where they're best suited. We just treat them as that terrible word, human resources, rather than people. You know, we just see them as something we assign to a project as opposed to the people. But if you want to increase the engagement, like, you know, the surveys are saying 70-80% of employees in some of the largest technology companies are disengaged. You know, we need to start changing that. If you want a more effective, efficient company, you need to change that. But also for employees to feel better about themselves, you know, their own lives and all, we need to change that.
I feel that passes through changing the way our HR operates. I feel that today HR is sometimes completely disconnected from the business. So they just hire, they take care about the well-being program, they take care about the new website for perks, and they are not that connected to the day-to-day operations. And I feel that HR needs to be more embedded with the real needs of the business in order for this to move forward. Otherwise, you end up in a kind of collision between the aspirations of employees, the needs of a project, and then HR that is basically not looking or not considering this, and only looking for the annual reviews and to those plans. I think there's something in HR that needs to change.
Antonio, if I caught on for you that, I'll always love Patagonia as a model. There's no reason we can't all be Patagonias. Honestly, there isn't. And I think to your point, it's the systems we've put in place and we've anchored down. We can take a look at those.
Yeah, and I think so as well. Your question about Seattle earlier, I think, is maybe part of the problem here, Antonio. You know, we've turned HR into a shared service, you know, and the shared service very often is located close to headquarters or somewhere else, and yet it's dealing with people that are sometimes don't even share the same language, definitely don't share the same culture, and yet it's trying to decide what's right and wrong, you know, having very little empathy for the employees, you know. So and I think it comes out of that hollowing of organizations. We're making them leaner, and actually what we're losing very often is the empathy parts, you know.
I would say that the human resource development too. I think when we say HR, I think a lot of organizations now make the distinction between the processes of HR, the benefits, the payroll, all that kind of stuff, and the talent development, or they call it succession planning, whatever. But the idea is, and we've talked about self-awareness, you know, when people come into the workforce now, they're not even aware of their own skills and competencies in the context of the marketplace. Like they know what they love to do. And so HR, one of the ways they can enhance the experience of their employees is to help them become more self-aware about what are their skills and competencies beyond what their degree is in. And their limited understanding, so that what HR actually does is literally mine the resource of all the humans who are in the organization, like what's in there that's untapped that we can nourish.
Yeah, and you know, one that I love, Fran, and I heard we're doing an interview series at the moment through the Digital Transformation Lab, you know, in terms of high performance teams. So some of it is coming out of just normal companies, you know, and talking about what they're doing. But one very interesting, I suppose, little tidbit from that is that we know that one of the biggest issues with new joins onboarding is people just don't feel connected, they don't meet people or whatever. So there's actually some evidence that now suggests that actually one of the most important onboarding activities is to start dropping people into existing networks, getting them to know people across the companies that they can go to if there's ever a problem, and their future success as employees, but also feeling empowered comes from that. The extent to which we do that at the start will probably determine people's success in the company thereafter. And I think it's something we forget.
There's a window of opportunity there that I find really exciting, which is when we onboard somebody, we typically teach them how things are already done, which of course is what, as a new person, I want to know. I want to know how to succeed here. And what the opportunity is okay, you're the new employee, watch how we do things. What do you see that we don't see? What do you see that could be better? Or what do you go, why do they do it that way? And get that information out of them too. It's an opportunity.
I like
that. Of course, yes, John, please.
Sorry, one other, I love what Fran and Paidi were just talking about there. I just wanted to add one other thing, because we're talking about HR and we're talking about talent and development, and I'd put a plug in, because where we work, our learning organization is amazing. And one of the things that they do is they figure out straight away that a lot of people don't know how to learn. Or if they do, what we give for them to learn, we haven't figured out the different learning styles. And so one of the things that they do at Hitachi Vantara, which I found powerful, is there's a whole module up front on how do we learn, and how does that help us along the way.
So we're about to close, but I need to ask is, do you feel that it's important to give people a flexibility in terms of how they learn? And what I mean by this is not just providing a set of tools, is to letting people choose how they move forward in terms of their learning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
it's a necessity, I think, Antonio. It's people are going to insist on it, you know. So I think it's a done deal, really. It's just slow.
So I think we have to dedicate a program just to that topic. So we are at the hour to do a very interesting conversation. So thank you, Fran. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paidi.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
And thank you also to our colleagues at Digital Transformation Lab, Tony Moroni, Granny Banyol, Jeremy Hayes, and Ken Russell. And if you are listening to this, please follow the conversations on LinkedIn and Twitter. We have plenty of posts there. If you have any questions, just you can address directly to our panelists. And it was great to have you with us, and look forward for you all to join us on our next session that we will be publishing the details very soon. Thank you so much.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you. Thanks, Antonio. Thanks,